In this lesson, we'll take a look at the tools in the toolbox. We'll start by creating a demonstration canvas that is 1920 by 1080. I'll go ahead and just tone it a light gray like this. I'm going to collapse my mixer, and now we can take a look at the toolbox. The toolbox has lots of different tools. We've used the brush tool, we've played with some of the navigation tools, but there's lots of other tools here that can do different things. We're mainly going to focus on the ones that we haven't already looked at, or the ones that require a bit more explanation. Let's start with the brush tool since that's at the top. We know that the brush tool allows us to add paint to our canvas. We also know that we can change some of these properties. These properties will change depending on the brush type we have selected. So if I select this glazing brush called Clouds, you can see I get the glazing property. If I select a watercolor brush, then I get some watercolor properties. The universal properties like size and opacity are always there. If I select a different tool, then I might get different properties in the properties bar. For example, the paint bucket has different properties than the text tool or the eraser. Going back to the brush tool, there's also a property for freehand stroke or straight line stroke. We've been using freehand stroke to just draw a freehand stroke, but we could also enable straight line stroke. In this mode, we click to create a point, and then tap again somewhere else while holding and dragging to create a straight line. And we could continue tapping to create segments, to create something like that. This particular brush has some properties that cause it to taper, but if we select a different brush, let's say smooth pen, then we might get a stroke that's more uniform. As long as you keep tapping, you're going to keep creating segments. So if you want to stop the line segment, you can either switch to the freeform drawing mode up in the properties bar, or you can press V on your keyboard. This will end the line segment and switch you to straight line drawing mode. You can also press B to switch to freeform drawing mode, and then back to V. B and V are next to each other on the keyboard to make it easy to switch between these modes. You can also invoke the eraser with the N key, which is next to those. I'll go back to the freeform mode. Another way to draw a straight line is to hold Shift on your keyboard. When I hold Shift, it's like I'm using a ruler. I can't paint off of that straight line. I can make vertical straight lines, horizontal straight lines, and diagonal straight lines simply by holding Shift. If I go to Edit, Preferences, General, we have an option to align constrained brushstrokes to canvas. To show you what this is doing, I'm going to rotate my canvas, and I'm going to hold Shift, and when I do, it aligns the brushstroke to the edges of the canvas. If we go to Edit, Preferences, General, and I disable that, now when I hold Shift, it's always going to be horizontal or vertical relative to me. I'm going to go ahead and set it back to its default. Earlier we looked at brush green briefly, but let's go more in depth into that. This particular brush can use green, although it isn't enabled. So you can see I create a stroke like this, but I could make a grainy stroke if I just add some green to it. Adding more green creates more texture in this case. But you may find that green works inversely depending on the brush you have selected. If I select blunt chalk found in chalk, pastels, and crayons, right now the green is set very low and I'm getting more grain. If I set green higher, then I'm getting less grain. So if I go back to smooth pen, you can see that works inversely. It may be a little bit confusing, but just move grain one way or the other and see what kind of result you get. I'm going to select a blender called Coarse Oily Blender, and green can also affect the look of blenders. Right now green is at 100%, and I get something that's really oily and smudgy. But if I reduce grain really low, then I get something that looks a little bit different. The paint's a little bit thicker, or maybe even wetter. I'm going to clear this out, and I'm going to return to blunt chalk. I'm going to set the grain pretty low here, and the grain that we see is based on our paper texture that we have selected. We can choose a different paper texture here from the bottom of the toolbox. We have all these different textures to choose from. Let's try one that looks like canvas. We can try one that looks a little bit more rough. There's all kinds of different canvases that you can choose from watercolor to gessoed canvas, and so on. If I clear that out and I go to Effects, Apply Surface Texture, you can see that texture applied to the canvas. The green is essentially the relief on the canvas. I'll click on OK, and then I'll paint using light pressure, and you can see that the paint goes into that texture. It starts to fill in those depressions. But if I start to use heavier pressure, then I start to cover it. So if I set grain higher, then it's just going to require less pressure to completely cover that grain. If I set grain lower, then it's going to require more pressure or more overlapping strokes to finally build that up to where it gets completely covered. And it may not ever be completely covered depending on how low you set grain. I'm going to clear this layer out. You'll notice that when I clear a layer when I've toned my canvas, the canvas defaults to that toned color. Aside from making it look like you're painting with a particular type of media, grain can also be useful to generate different types of brush shapes. For example, if I select Thick Scratchy Sketch, and I select a greenish color like this, I might be able to get a nice tree effect. I want to make my grain a little bit higher so I can fill that in more. And we get all these really nice leaf shapes. I can make my color a bit brighter, go over it again like that, or I could completely change my paper texture to something different. Let's say simulated wood grain, and I'll put that over the top so that I'm combining those two textures together. I can make it brighter and do pebbleboard to add some highlights on top of that. These paper textures are incredibly useful. Now that we've explored most of what the brush tool can do, let's move on to the next tool. Because the dropper doesn't have any additional properties, we'll go ahead and skip past that, and let's select the Paint Bucket tool. I've gone ahead and loaded the Paint Bucket tool template, and the Paint Bucket can flood fill the canvas, or it can fill inside of lines or similar colors. I have a few layers here: circle lines, color fill, which is just a blank layer, and gradient. There's also the canvas layer, which has some marks on it that are merged with the canvas. I'm going to select a nice red color that I can see here. And on the circle lines layer, I'll click with the Paint Bucket, and I can fill inside of those lines. If I click over here on this circle that's not a closed shape, the paint floods outside of that shape and fills the whole canvas. If I fill inside of this shape, it's a closed shape, so the paint doesn't go outside. I could select a different color if I wanted to, and I could change that color. I could also change the color here as well. And I can select from my color swatches, and I can even move these RGB sliders to dial in the exact color that I want. I can also change my fill to source image, but we'll take a look at that later. There's also a tolerance property which helps the Paint Bucket determine when to stop filling. To see how this works, we'll go to the gradient layer. With tolerance set at 32, I'll go ahead and click right here in the middle on the gray color. And from the gray color I clicked on, it goes 16 value steps one way and 16 value steps the other way. Or in other words, making the tolerance higher is going to encompass a larger color range. Making it lower is going to encompass a smaller color range. In terms of filling line art, the tolerance is going to make the fill go closer to the edge. If I fill that and zoom in, you can see that does a pretty decent job of filling. But if I undo and I set tolerance higher to 99, you can see it makes that edge really jagged and kind of eats into it. So if you're going to be filling stuff this way, then a tolerance setting of 32 is probably pretty good. However, this is not the best way to fill line art. You should actually be filling your line art using a separate layer. I'm not going to go into detail about how to do that in this video, but I will link you to a reference video that will explain the process. But as you can see, if I really quickly just kind of color behind my lines on a separate layer, I can edit my lines separately from my fills. You can see in this example where I use the Paint Bucket, everything is combined together. But in this example where it's on a separate layer, I could change the colors of it and edit it in lots of different ways. The next tool is the text tool. And this is just your average text tool. You can click to create an entry point for your text. You can type in Painter Essentials 8. And just like in a word processor, you can select the text and edit it. You can select the text with a select all and change the color of it. You can change the alignment and the font size and so on. I'm not going to spend too much time on this tool, but you could use it to sign your artwork or add a watermark to it. We can move that text around with the layer adjuster, and we can move it anywhere on the canvas because it's on its own layer. Now this is a text layer, so I can always go back to the text tool and I can edit that text. If I select the layer adjuster and I move one of these corner points, I can stretch the text to make it larger or smaller, but I can also squash it, and that's not good. I can also hold down Control and I can rotate it. Or if I want to, I can right click on that layer and I can convert it to a default layer. It's no longer editable with the text tool now, but I could select something like a blender or a paintbrush and I can treat it like it's regular paint. We already looked at everything the eraser can do. It also has a straight and freehand drawing mode. So let's move on to the crop tool. The crop tool can just remove excess canvas. So let's say we wanted to crop this down and make it just the size of this text. We can do that. I simply dragged a box and I can move the corners or the top, bottom, left, and right sides just to reposition that. If I want it to have fixed proportions, I can turn that on. And now if I draw a box, it's locked into a 1x1 square. Or if I wanted it to be 1x2, I could draw another box and now it's 1x2. If I wanted to reverse that and have it 2x1, I could do that. Now this is an arbitrary crop, so you're not choosing a specific pixel or inch size here. But to apply this, you click on the check to commit. Now my canvas is cropped, and it's now this new size should I choose to save it. If you're cropping like this, you may want to go ahead and choose Save As, that way you're saving a copy, unless of course you want to discard that cropped information. But what I mean by an arbitrary crop is if I go to Canvas Resize, and I change the unit to inches, this is just a random size, 4.3 and 2.15. It's not a standard canvas size. There are ways to crop to a specific canvas size, but I'll link you to a reference video about that. If you want to do a freeform crop, simply uncheck fixed proportions, and now you can freeform crop. If you want to cancel your crop, you can cancel it, and you can undo to undo the crop. Moving on to the next tool, we have the layer adjuster. This lets you move layers around, so I'll select that Painter Essentials 8 layer, and I can drag it around. If I click on this other blank layer here, I select blue, and I paint something onto it with the smooth pen. I can use the layer adjuster to move that around. Now when you're moving layers around, you're moving them around in two-dimensional space on the canvas, either up, down, left, or right. But if you want to change the order on the Z-axis, or move things in front of each other or behind each other, we can do that in the Layers palette, and we'll be explaining that a little bit later. There is a property at the top for Auto Select Layer, and when that's enabled, whichever pixels you click on are going to determine which layer gets selected here. So you can automatically select a layer simply by clicking on it. When the layers start to overlap, it gets a little bit tricky, and if you happen to have a tint layer that's over your whole canvas, then it's going to be impossible to select a layer this way. We can turn that off. I'll go ahead and select this Painter Essentials 8 layer with the text on it. And new in Corel Painter Essentials 8, there are some properties in the properties bar for the layer adjuster tool. We can flip layers horizontally, vertically. We can copy layers, and then paste them. That pasted it into the original location, and I can move it around. You can also change the order of selected layers, which is what I mentioned you could do in the Layers palette. So for example, I could select that layer, and I could move it to the bottom. That moves to the bottom of the layer order. We can also select layers, and then we can merge them, or collapse them, which just fuses them together into a single layer. Or we can drop selected layers or all layers to the canvas. And when we do that, that makes all of our layers into a single layer. Now I can no longer move them around independently, but I could, for example, blend them all together. I'm going to undo to where I have my layers back. I'll go back to the layer adjuster. We can also align layers horizontally or vertically. I'm going to delete these extra layers here, and I'll just use the smooth pen to paint a couple of other layers. Now if I hold Shift and select all three of those layers, go to the layer adjuster, and select vertical centers, they all snap to align on their vertical centers. And you can align these layers in lots of different ways. I'm going to load the template called Transform Lady, and now let's take a look at the Transform tool. This is found hiding underneath the layer adjuster tool. You just tap and hold on it to get this submenu. Anytime you see a little triangle like this, you know there's a subtool hiding underneath. So we'll select the Transform tool, and this will allow us to transform our layer. I'm going to open up this Transform Lady group, and I'm going to select the hair background layer. I'll go to the Transform tool. That puts a box around that layer. And then I can drag this up or down, or I can drag the sides here to reshape the hair. There are different modes for transformation. Right now I'm moving, but it can also scale and move. I can scale without moving, and you can hold Alt to scale from the center, or you can hold Shift to constrain the proportions so they don't squash. There's also a rotate mode, and you can rotate. We're rotating from the center of axis here, but we can change the position of that very easily. I could take it and I can move it maybe higher up here, and now when I rotate, it's from that center of axis. It's kind of like I put a push pin in it, and it's rotating on the push pin. I can also skew, which just kind of shifts the pixels like this. I'll cancel that transformation. We can also distort. So I can pull out each of these corners like this, or I can perspective distort, which creates perspective distortion. So stuff will kind of converge like this. This works better if you're doing walls and floors and things like that. I'll go ahead and just skew the hair a little bit. I'll click on the check to apply the transformation, and now that's been permanently applied unless I do an undo. I can select multiple layers, and I can transform those as well, and I can transform her all together. Now she will squish down unless I hold Shift, so I'll just hold Shift and that'll keep her from getting squashed. Lift my pin up, let go of Shift, click on the check to commit, and now she's smaller. Now when I've done this, this is a destructive edit and I've thrown some pixels away. So if I make her larger again, it's going to start to look a little bit blurry or blocky. So you don't want to scale stuff up and down too much. I've gone ahead and loaded the selections template. And the next tools we'll look at are the selection tools. There's a whole submenu with a rectangular selection tool, an oval selection tool, a freeform lasso, a magic wand, and a selection adjuster tool. Let's start with the rectangular selection tool. I'll click on my lines layer. This is just the line art separate from the fills. And I'm going to draw a selection around the mouth. This selects only those pixels on that layer. So now if I were to go to the layer adjuster tool, I can move that around. Now when I do that, that automatically creates a layer floating object, which just means that these pixels are temporarily separate from the other pixels, but they're still part of the same layer. So I could shift the mouth around if I want to. When I'm done, click back on the lines, and they combine back together. Another way I might want to use the selection tool is to separate part of a layer. I'll use the oval selection tool, and as you can see, it makes a selection, but this time it's doing it with an oval shape. I'll select the mouth again, and this time I'll go to Edit, Cut, or I could press Ctrl X. I'll go to Edit, Paste in Place. Now I've cut that mouth onto its own separate layer, and then I could go to the Transform tool, and I could transform it in various ways to reshape it. If I wanted to fuse those layers back together, I could select both of them and merge them together with Ctrl E. Now they're a single layer again. Let's look at another selection tool, which is the lasso. You could use this to make a more complex selection by drawing it. So for example, I could cut and paste the eye there, and then I could transform that eye. Let's take a look at another selection tool, and that is the magic wand. The magic wand works similar to the paint bucket, but rather than filling, it's going to select areas of similar color. So for example, if I go to the canvas layer that has all these colors, I can click here on the blue, and I'm going to select only the blue, and I can click through and select these colors. And similar to the paint bucket, there's a tolerance setting, so I can set this higher to encompass more of a color range. So now I'm getting all of these blue colors here, and even some of the purples. Or I can set it just a bit lower, deselect and select again to get a smaller range of colors. If I click over here on the yellow, you can see I get the yellow-orange and that darker yellow color as well. You can also add and subtract from selections. So if I click on the Add mode, I can keep adding to the selection to select a wider range of colors. Or if I click on Subtract, then I can subtract. I can also click on this Lines layer, which has my line art. I'll go back to New Selection mode, and I'll click inside of the lines. And I can make a selection inside of that head shape. Then I could go to a separate layer, select a color, and fill that selection with Ctrl F. Just move that down beneath my lines. And now I'm able to fill those lines on a separate layer. However, the paint does not go all the way to the edge, and it leaves a little bit of a gap there. If we want to get it closer to the edge, if I set my tolerance to 32, and then create a new selection inside of the lines, then I can go to the Transform Selection tool, and once I do that, then I can go to Select, Widen, and I can widen the selection by, let's say, 3 pixels. Now if I go to that layer beneath the lines and fill it, you can see that fill spills over the edge and gives me a much better result. But it's still not perfect. I'll undo a bit. The Selection Adjuster tool can also move the selection around, and it can make it smaller or even rotate the selection. So it works very much like the Transform Layer tool, except it deals with selections. If I move it all the way over here and make it smaller, then I could fill it with blue, and you can see what it did. Next, I'll open a template called Yellow Flowers, and we'll take a look at the Rubber Stamp tool. The Rubber Stamp tool is a cloning tool, and it can basically copy pixels from one area of the canvas to another. For example, I can hold Alt and click right here to create a target point. And when I paint on the other side of the canvas, I'm going to teleport the paint from one end of the canvas to the other. Make my brush much bigger so I can paint in a larger area. You can see that target move around, and that's showing the area that's going to be cloned. So if I move down this way, you can see that I start to clone this little bud. And if I move up this way, then I'm getting that flower that's up above. A practical way that you might want to use this is to remove areas of a photo. So I could sample right here on this background, make my brush smaller, and then I could go in and remove this little bud if I don't want this. You can also change the brush size and the opacity up here as properties. So I could reduce the opacity just to kind of subtly remove that so the edge isn't so sharp. I could sample over here and try to remove this one as well. Hiding underneath the clone stamp are the dodge and burn tools. I'll open the dodge and burn template to demonstrate on. We'll try dodge first. And if I paint here on the nose, you can see that it's lightening that area. So dodge makes stuff lighter. And as you can imagine, the burn tool, which we can select up here in the properties bar, is going to make things darker. So you can use this to touch up photos or to work on portraits, or you can even use it for painting. It just adds more contrast. As with the other brush tools, you can fine-tune the opacity and the size, and there's even a straight line drawing mode. These tools also work on color. As you can see, I can make color darker as well. The next tool is the mirror painting tool. When we click on that, it enables mirror painting mode, and this green line appears, which represents your symmetry planes. So what you draw on one side will appear mirrored on the other. I'll select the brush tool. I have the smooth pen selected. I'll choose black for my color. And I could draw something that looks kind of like a dragon. This tool also works really well to create mandalas. To do that, you want to change to the Kaleidoscope subtool. This does basically the same thing, but it's going to mirror it in segments. You can choose the number of segments up here. You can go from 3 all the way up to 12. Let's just do 3. You have to be careful with this line because if you move it, you will rotate the segments or move the symmetry plane, which may not be what you want to do. So just try not to move it. But as you can see, I can create these really nice mandala patterns. I'll go back to the Kaleidoscope tool. I can turn Kaleidoscope painting mode on and off. So now when I paint with it off, I'm not painting in Kaleidoscope mode. If I want to turn it back on, then I just click on the tool. I can also change the color of the guides if I want those to be a different color. And I can toggle between Kaleidoscope and mirror painting mode here in the properties bar. As you can see, I've rotated the symmetry plane, so that may not be what you want. You can select the mirror painting tool and try to rotate it back, but it's pretty hard to get it back upright again because there's no way to reset it. You can also add a horizontal plane or show and hide the vertical plane separately, and this will allow you to get symmetry on both planes. We already looked at these navigation tools, so we'll skip over those. And the last item in the toolbox is the main and additional color. This doesn't get used very much in Corel Painter Essentials 8, but we'll take a look at how we can use it. Most brushes use your main color. Your additional color is behind it here, and we can click back and forth between the two to choose a color. If you look really closely, you might be able to see that there's a little ring that surrounds the icon so that you can tell which one is selected. You can also see over here in the color picker which color is selected, and you can toggle the main and additional colors using swap colors in the top right menu, or the keyboard shortcut of Shift and X. Let's take a look at a brush that can use the additional color. We'll go to FX, Neon Pen. For my main color, I'll choose green. I'll click on this little arrow to toggle to my additional color. Now when I paint a stroke with this pen, it's blue and green at the same time. If I change one of the colors to red, now you can see it's red and green. So if you're ever painting with a brush and you find that it has another color included, that brush can use the additional color. It's important to remember to click back onto your main color because most brushes use the main color. Otherwise, if you're stuck on your additional color and you select a brush that does not use the additional color and you try to change your color, you're going to wonder why the brush is not changing. That's because you need to click back on your main color and then choose the color that you want. That brings us to the end of this lesson. Coming up in the next lesson, we'll explore the menu commands and what they can do.